thank you all for some very illuminating talks. I have questions for two people, if that's okay.
Yes.
First for Scott. Hi, Scott. Can you hear me? I guess so. I saw your hand. So I have a question about compassion fade and psychic numbing, and the degree to which these are sort of adaptive strategies that have helped us to survive in some way, and in some sense are a part of our genetic makeup. And I don't feel comfortable talking about genetic materialism and that kind of thing, but assuming that these are adaptive strategies, I'm wondering if you might say a few words about how louder pictures and more evocative scenes sort of works with hardwiring issues. And I mean, this is something that I deal with ecophobia. We have an amygdala, and some of our contempt for the environment isn't ecophobia, like when you're running away from a lion. And so I wonder how you deal with hardwiring with regard to psychic numbing and compassion fade and those kinds of things.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, the concept of psychic numbing was first developed by the psychologist Robert J. Lifton in the 1960s when he was studying survivors of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima. And he identified psychic numbing, exactly as you say, as an adaptive evolutionary adaptation to an overwhelming experience, a terrifying, shocking experience. And he said that psychic numbing enabled the physical survivors of the Hiroshima bombing to survive emotionally and carry on with their lives in the face of that overwhelming event. But Lifton and a colleague of his, Greg Mitchell, wrote an article in the 1990s that we included in the book, Numbers and Nerves, where they say, although psychic numbing might enable us to survive certain types of experiences, psychic numbing has become an impairment as we receive information about serious situations in the world today that require a response other than paralysis, other than numbing and kind of pushing these terrifying and overwhelming phenomena to the side. So Lifton, who identified psychic numbing as a positive response in some situations, has more recently said that this same psychic numbing is now a problem that we need to find ways to overcome. So in 1989, Paul Ehrlich of Population Bomb, reputation, the population ecologist, and a colleague of his, psychologist Robert Ornstein, published the book New World, New Mind, Toward a Conscious Evolution. And Ehrlich and Ornstein argue in that book, New World, New Mind, that we need to find a way to consciously push back against certain hardwiring tendencies or hardwired tendencies that we have. So the idea is that we can't snap our fingers and change our physiology, our emotional tendencies that may be deeply embedded in the functions of our brain, but we can, with a certain amount of consciousness about the way our brains function, we can respond to some degree to these insensitivities and find a way to be more sensitive to the meaning and the importance of these phenomena that in some ways elude our sensory abilities. The phenomena that we describe as slow violence, which are some of the most potentially cataclysmic and serious phenomena that we face today, fundamentally, intrinsically, are beyond our sensory abilities. But we can gather knowledge about them in certain ways that might inspire us to respond individually and collectively, and we need to do so consciously. So I hope that responds to what you're saying. I agree with you. We are wired to experience psychic numbing, but there is perhaps the potential for us to mitigate that psychic numbing so that we are less complacent about serious phenomena in the world, serious challenges.
Those responses themselves can cause more numbing. I mean, the louder the image, the more enough, and it's a very difficult question, I think. And anyway, thank you for your answer.
Yeah, well, I didn't mention loudness as one of the possibilities,
well,
but there are various types of adaptive discourses that might, just to some extent, chip away at the numbness that people experience. But this needs further study, and that's the field of cognitive narratology or cognitive eco-narratology aims to do more of that research. So perhaps we'll have a clearer sense of our ability to overcome some of these examples of insensitivity. Thank you. I'll let you go on to your next question.
I have a question for Scott, and maybe you can ask another question to Jeroen if we have time. So thank you so much for introducing us to your website, Scott. It looks very useful. I look forward to introducing it to my students. I have a question about the concept of singularity. And perhaps the tension or dialogue between singularity and the individual, especially now with the term, the individual is such a invested and contested term in the neoliberal era, being seen as the dominant cognitive and moral subject to be able to make, moral, ecologically responsive behavior. So I wonder what singularity means here. Does it mean the singularity of the personal, the person who's feeling, the human experiencer, the singularity of the authority of the non-human forces and entities, the singularity of the human, non-human affective and ecological entanglement? So I just wonder whether you can further talk a little bit more about the complexity of singularity in relation to the individual. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that interesting question. And I appreciate the idea of probing further what does singularity actually mean, and what might the limitations of singularity be. Actually, as we tend to use singularity, it has a lot to do with scale, with one versus many, and with the way the mind seems to process information about multiple subjects as opposed to a more focused, concentrated kind of attention. It has a lot to do with the psychology of attention and the ability of our minds to grasp and focus on a certain number of phenomena, whether these are conscious, sentient phenomena or objects of any kind. These could be parts per million, on a chemical level, not necessarily living phenomena. So the individual refers to numbers, not necessarily to conscious or human-like phenomena. But I was thinking about this, I think especially as I was listening to Alvin speak about various types of heroism, referring to climatic heroes and environmental heroes. And I was thinking of the role of protagonists in the films that Alvin was talking about. And those, often there were, if not individual, single protagonists, there were just a few characters who seemed to be leading the way in these films in representing complex identities. And it struck me that the use of certain complicated, fluid, exploratory individuals in those films was in line with what I was trying to say about the power of singularity in narrative discourse in any medium. And so I think the singular phenomenon, if we happen to be talking about it in terms of a narrative protagonist, could actually be a complex, fluid, complicated, representing a complicated identity of the kind that you're talking about in your question. And I wonder, Alvin, if you might even weigh in here a little bit about the role of protagonists in your film, and in the context of different types of heroism and the sort of identity modeling that occurs in these cinematic narratives.
Sure. Thanks, Scott, for this really perceptive engagement with my paper. And again, actually, to make a disclaimer, environmental humanities is one of the several fields that I'm still trying to work on more. And my approach is really more sort of from my investment in queer studies and sort of Hong Kong studies and Sinophone studies. But when I was preparing for this talk, I was trying to look at also other films, including Bong Joon-ho's earlier film Snowpiercer, which also turned into a TV series. And I noticed that even though the film relies on this climatic heroism and sort of how to survive, right, after the snow, the climate change and all of that, and even the revolts of the First Station and the working class is named after the hero, like Curtis. Towards the end of the film, actually, those who survive is the Black young boy who was forced to work in the furnace, right? And the other is the Korean young girl, and they were wearing this fur that was probably derived from polar bear or other kinds of wild animals. And at the end of the film is actually a mutual recognition between the polar bear and the Korean girl and the young boy. So I thought the film, even with these popular genre that lends itself to certain singular reading or certain readings of environmentalism and the political unconscious, there's also some kind of, as you mentioned, fluidity and affective intensities that might lend us to an alternative form of reading. So that's why I was really intrigued by, elsewhere I wrote about Fruit Chan's film about prostitution, as he has a trilogy of film about sex worker. And I read it more as a sort of border-crossing transnational figure. But I realized if we expand sort of queer ecology and ecological and environmental humanities informed by sort of this attention to gender and queer studies, you can actually think through many popular genre and cultural forms. So you don't have to, just be a specialist in order to, right, employ a kind of queer ecological reading practice and hermeneutic. So that's, yeah.
It seems to me, the 4 different presentations, have dealt with the media, right? For Scott, poems, and Jerome, artwork, and the other 2, Wei-Ping and Alvin's, films, and these medium, this form was somehow good at manipulating emotions. And I guess, when we come to the notions of singularity, that means if we tie it to emotions, passions, the emotions, cannot be repeated, right? Singularity will just happen, right in the spot, it comes naturally in response, to the changing circumstances or the objects we encounter. But all these art objects, so to speak, that all the presenters have touched on, somehow they are good at manipulating these emotions, and always with an objective to repeat them in different circumstances or different contexts. So I kind of run into this contradiction when we talk about affect, emotions. We somehow emphasize the spontaneity of all these passions or feelings. However, when we come to tie it to art form, films, poems, whatever art objects somehow, we kind of try to repeat them, rehearse them, and try to achieve so-called poignancy, as was Scott mentioned right at the beginning. So I don't know whether there's any kind of contradictions in the way how we understand affect, especially we may not be that much different from other politicians, but only we believe that we achieve a kind of good objective in order to awaken the general consciousness about the environmental issues and all that. So I don't know whether this is an open kind of questions, but I don't know how the presenters will respond to this issue.
Yeah, I was actually about to point out, or actually, I was actually thinking about it in a very similar way. But I just want to say, Scott, it's a super quick comment. I really love your presentation in a way that, because it resonates with a lot of things that I've been looking into in relationship to Buddhism, especially with Thich Nhat Hanh's idea of interbeing, and also Pema Chödrön's idea of, again, the 4 stages of reconciliation. But we can talk more about this. But I actually, in relation to what you have said, Casey, and also what I think have said, I think your reading of the film really offers me a very different perspective of the film. And it's really in relation to what you've said about what we are really thinking. I wouldn't say versus, in relation to what politicians are thinking, because Far, Far Away was indeed being selected by the HKETO Brussels as part of the package of the celebration of the 25th anniversary of Handover. And it was actually being packaged to different film festivals. And I saw it in Udine without any contextualization. I'm sorry to say that the Udine audience hated that film. And because there was no contextualization, no one knew what was going on. And so it sounded more like an internet film that was just selling Hong Kong. As a matter of fact, HKETO's perspective was to say that, well, here's a bunch of films, including this film, that are actually celebrating a renewal of developmentalism, but a more ecological developmentalism. It's like these young people are moving on. They're actually finding a way to create a new future. For that moment, so to speak. So, so in some ways, your presentation really inspires me to think about precisely that relationship, right? Like, how does a film that, from your perspective, is a counteraction toward, against, or in relation to developmentalism, but it can be equally being, if you say, appropriated or being instrumentalized by HKETO or any kind of developmentalist agency as a promotion of developmentalism.
I think it's to do with contextualization. I mean, without context, I think it is quite easy to misinterpret, to misread some of the textual clues embedded in the narrative. I mean, a lot of the things I mentioned, for example, Prince Edward being a site of political suppression, I think perhaps can be easily messaged by audiences without us knowledge about what happened to countries like Hong Kong. So I think it is to do with contextualization. But I would like to get back to the question raised by Casey in relation to this notion of singularity and also motion. I think that what I find particularly interesting, fascinating about the Far, Far Away is ways in which the environment is experienced and explored effectively. I mean, as I said, one of the things I find very interesting about films that it deals with some fundamental issues to do with the causes and some of the causes and consequences of the anthropocene. But thus, I mean, the film, at one level, it can be enjoyed as a romantic comedy, I mean, without thinking very much about it. But especially for those of us who are familiar with the history and geography of Hong Kong, I mean, it becomes something quite different. It can be, it actually I mean, it resonates actually with a lot of us who experienced firsthand what happened a couple of years back and through the destruction of the democracy protests and so on. So I think a lot is to do with contextualization. There's local knowledge. So I think I think what happened at the film festival, I think that was a bit, trapped with contextualization and more information about the context, trapped audiences and viewers will be able to get different view about what the film can mean. And singularity, to me, I'd like to get back to the idea of singularity. I mean, it reminds me of the discussion about the difference between the distinction between singularity on one hand and individuality on the other, a distinction made by Deleuze. He was talking about this particular incident in which, this passage from Charles Dickens, the references to the distinction between a and the indefinite article and definite article. I mean, when we talk about individuality, we're talking about one particular incident. For example, we use the definite article verb to talk about something. We focus attention on that particular thing. But when we shift to the indefinite article, this becomes a singularity that resonates with different levels. A human being, as opposed to that particular person. So I think that singularity in this, it just reminds me of this distinction, which I think can be useful in thinking about the different levels. Scott talked about the transscalar shift, shifting between different levels of understanding. So I think this is a very, very useful idea.
Could I respond to that as well?
Yeah, please.
Number one, poor Amos. We mustn't tell him, but he was there, right? In Udine, he wasn't there. We mustn't tell Amos. But Casey was raising the issue of the mechanism of generating effects. I think would long and Pahal be a comparable mechanism?
Right, I guess. Not sure.
So honestly, the techniques and technology. The technology
of the generating.
Okay.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Can I add 2 comments? Yeah. About this conversation of singularity, I think one of the issues here is how to multiply and keep generating singularity in that sense, like Wei Ping mentioned that it's fluid, it's unbounded, it keeps shifting. So that is not one dominant singularity and starts to generate a sameness for everyone else. So how singularity could keep multiply, and that maybe leads to the question of power relations coming into singularity. So singularity, based in a context, right? And then that leads to my second comment, which is about the question of the individual self, the person who is feeling the artwork, So according to this edited collection, Affective Eco-Criticism, I think it's a very good point here about how FX points to how we are embedded, because it highlights the sense about how this embodied phenomenon and shows we are connected to a number of more than human things, objects, animals, built environments. In that sense, it highlights that we are material. Then that undermines the very intentional subject of self-determination in the protagonist, for example, in Far, Far Away, that the so-called self-determination is an illusion. The self is effectively porous and materially mediated through all these relationships of context, of environment, of ecology, pointing to a possibility of multiplying and shifting singularity. Does that make sense?
Is that a question for me? I think it makes sense. I interpret your interesting comment in various ways. I was going to say earlier when Wai Ping was speaking, I'm interested in I find myself questioning the role of art, the types of poems that I was using as examples, or various other works, including visual works, films and photography that I use, that tends to be didactic. It tends to, often the types of artworks that I choose in the environmental context, particularly in relation to climate change, they function as a form of didactic art rather than truly exploratory or politically neutral types of art that may be testing boundaries, exploring the kind of experimental fluidity of human identity. Rather, the types of artwork that I find myself emphasizing in my own studies, have a clearer argument that they're trying to make. And they almost seem to, at times, breach some of our expectations of good art, good poetry, because their arguments are so plain and so evident. And it's clear that they're trying to teach the readers something, guide the readers in certain directions. But back to the earlier comment by Wai Ping about spontaneity, one of the interesting things that we've discovered through empirical studies of climate fiction, and I'm thinking especially of the work of Matthew Schneider-Meyerson, who studies various examples of climate fiction in the novel form particularly, he's found through his surveys of experimental subjects that often these subjects don't get the message. They don't respond in any kind of obvious way to the didactic messages of the artwork. Instead, readers tend to be more individualistic and spontaneous in their way of emotionally and intellectually responding to these narratives of climate fiction, often zeroing in on different aspects of the narratives than the authors even intended to convey or to highlight. So there is a certain degree of non-controllability in the way audiences respond even to didactic art. There's we can't predict it, and in some ways this is dismaying, because we would like to find a way to encourage the public to be more enlightened and attentive with regard to phenomena such as climate change. And yet, on another note, it's heartening to think that even didactic art might result in unexpected responses from audiences. Regarding this issue of the individual, I do think individual audience members might have the freedom to be affected in different ways by the works of art. And so there is inevitably a kind of individualism in the way readers, viewers, listeners react to these works. The messages are not so precise and so utterly dogmatic that they don't leave this kind of freedom in the way people respond. I didn't have a chance in my talk to include an example I often use when I'm talking about singularity and transscalar thinking, which is the digital composition artist and filmmaker from Seattle named Chris Jordan. And it's from him that I particularly take the phrase, the transscalar imaginary. And Jordan is interested in often taking numerous, sometimes thousands of individual objects and embedding them in a digital composition that viewers who are physically present with those compositions can walk up to, so they can look at the individual object and then they can walk back and see the collective. And so they experience this movement between the individual and the many, the one and the collective. And he particularly, I'm interested in a work by Jordan called Plastic Bottles 2007 that represents many thousands of plastic drink bottles, water bottles, and so forth. And he tells the story of being in an art museum with a friend of his viewing this plastic bottles composition, and his friend happens to be holding a plastic water bottle, and the perfect audience member. And the friend looks at the artwork and then looks sheepishly at the artist and says, "But it's only one bottle. It's only, it's not a big problem. It's just one bottle. It's not going to destroy the world." And then he says, "Now I understand your piece, which represents 2 million one bottles." And so it's, that the ability to make this leap between the individual and the many it's one example of an intellectual or cognitive tendency that we need to cultivate in ourselves in order to live more mindfully in a world where there are many types of challenges that we face that we will tend to ignore if we can't understand the connection between these large-scale phenomena and our own individual lives. So that's why the transscalar mode of thinking really seems fundamentally important to living in a meaningful, mindful way in the contemporary world. And this goes back to Simon's earlier question about, well, how do we do this? How do we train ourselves to do this when we are not physiologically built to think in this way? And I guess the most optimistic answer is that we might train ourselves to do a bit better than we currently do. We might be able to overcome some of our physiological cognitive limitations if we make an effort to do so. And that's the hope that seems to be embedded in some of this artwork.